Okay, all right. So it's October 29th, and this is the class on the overview of Chanukah, where we're going to kind of take it from the very beginning to the latest stuff on Chanukah. This class is being sponsored by webyeshiva.org, and I'm Rabbi Avi Weinstein. Okay, we're going to do something different this year that I haven't done before, which is usually I use a normal file, but because this particular class, we won't do this with every class, but this particular class is kind of a pre-class on Chanukah, you know, the influence of Chanukah, the origins of Chanukah, and after that we'll get more into both the halachic and agadic aspects of Chanukah, ending up with later halachas, modern issues, some chassidut, etc., you know, pending what we have time for. So right now, we want to start with the questions that always emerge with Chanukah. So first of all, Chanukah is like many things in our tradition, it has a certain complexity to it that is hard to ignore. What I mean by that is that the most information we have about the period of Chanukah and the Maccabees is a book we're not supposed to look at, which is the book of Maccabees, known as Maccabees 1 and 2. We preserve the manuscripts in Greek. We don't really have Hebrew manuscripts of the book of Maccabees. And Josephus, who seems to have taken most of what he knows also from the book of Maccabees. If you kind of see what he says, either in the Jewish Wars or in his, ancient history of the Jews. The book of Maccabees is noteworthy for what it tells us and also for what it doesn't tell us. What it tells us is that there was a certain complexity to the story that we know the parts that we want to emphasize. But there were other parts which we obviously had no interest in emphasizing, which was that there were altercations between the Jews and the Mityavnim, the people who wanted to assimilate to the Greek way of life. And in fact, according to the book of Maccabees, that conflict was fairly bitter, to the point that Antiochus originally came in to ostensibly be a mediator. Of course, he didn't want to be a mediator. He wanted to side with the people who were like him. And so therefore, those edicts emerged from him trying to impose the Mityavnims, the assimilationist values, on the other part of the population. Because it was, as it's pointed out, it usually wasn't Greece's thing to impose their values, on a group, unless that group was giving them trouble. They were happy to let people worship as they will. So it was unusual for them to do it in Israel. Anyway, that's the book of Maccabees version. We also have from that period the book of Judith, which we'll go into a little bit here. There certainly was a rebellion against Antiochus. It was certainly led by the Maccabees and their followers, and they won, all of which is true. And after they won, they created a Jewish commonwealth for a couple hundred years until the destruction of the Second Temple. More than 200 years. The interesting thing is that when you go to the Talmud, you virtually see no mention of the Maccabees and sparse mention of the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, who was the family that the Hasmonean kings who ruled during that period. And not only that, but you have very little Gemara on a festival that takes 8 days out of every year. That it might take up 8 days from a 365-day year, but it only takes up, you know, a daf and a half of the Gemara. So the percentages are somewhat lopsided between what we learn about it and how we tend to celebrate it. So that makes for very, very interesting understandings. Also, in the hands of the Talmud, the explanation we're given is very different. You know, what we choose to emphasize. And the most interesting thing I think about that is that the historical narrative, the narrative that's favored by the book of Maccabees and Josephus, would have been something that might have been grist for the historian's mill, but it would not necessarily have had any impact on popular Jewish life, tradition, and lore if it weren't for the advent of the state of Israel and a great Jewish army. When conquest was possible again, and because of that, models, you know, throughout the ages were once again, you know, brought to the fore. You know, we're dug up, as it were, and certainly the Chanukah story appealed to a fledgling army that was also fighting great odds with the Arab hordes around it. So you can understand how they gleaned some inspiration from the Chanukah story as evidenced by the book of Maccabees. And because Israel was a secular state and wasn't necessarily constrained by the edicts of the rabbis, so this romantic notion emerged, you know, in the state of Israel. And that's an interesting thing to ponder, and it manifested itself in many ways. One of the famous Hanukkah songs was Mi Yamalel Gvurot Yisrael, you know, who will sing the praises of the might of Israel, which is basically a distortion of the verse, which is Mi Yamalel Gvurot Hashem. So the fact is that the state had taken pride in what it had done, in its army, and in the prowess of the people at the expense of the magnificence or the praise of God. So, you know, that's one example of how, you know, how Hanukkah gets a different life, you know, in a secular state. Also, understand that Chanukah, the story of Chanukah, in many ways was also probably an inspiration for the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which happened a bit later, and the understanding that the few could conquer the many, and that being in the consciousness of the people hundreds of years later, you know, gave them a sense that that all was possible, except as we know, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, where Rabbi Akiva had thought that the Bar Kokhba had the potential to be the Mashiach, didn't work out. And then not only did it not work out, the presumption was that it wasn't worth it. That unfortunately, you know, in many understandings, it was a disaster, which kind of colored the reticence of the Talmud to be a militant book. Now, part of that could be because the Talmud that's the most important is emanating from Bavel, where Jewish sovereignty is certainly a thing of the past, and you're not even getting the succor from the land because you're living in a foreign land. Whereas, at least in Israel, even if people are not sovereign, they still are living on their land, but they too had taken a much more reticent posture vis-a-vis being subjects to the powers around them. You know, the rebellion didn't turn out well. You know, the whole notion of Machakim l'Mashiach, to wait for the Messiah, as opposed to bringing the Messiah, was very much the word of the day. So the question is, you know, do these traditions ever mix together, or are these traditions basically apart and separate? In the Chanukah of we who practice, you know, doing the mitzvot and are engaged with Chazal, do we have anything in common? Do we have an acknowledgement of what people who are not engaged with Chazal but still have Chanukah in some way? You know, are we doing, you know, the same thing, as it were? Is there any overlap? And I think there is some. It is, you know, noteworthy that Chanukah, there's the whole other element of Chanukah happening when it happens, which is in the winter, when the nights are the longest and the days are the shortest. And that is a particular time when lots of, you know, religious communities have holidays. Ki'ilu, it's as if to bring light into the darkest time. Now, that's also interesting because, you know, people have these solstice festivals, etc. And, you know, Josephus referred to Chanukah, even though usually Chanukah is called Chanukah, and that's its technical name, but it's Josephus who brought in this idea of it being the festival of lights, which seems to have been a popular name as well. And what's interesting about that is that modern Israelis adopted that. You know, they say Chag Urim Sameach, Festival of Lights, even though they also say, well, you know, you'll go to Mea Shearim and they'll say a Freilichen Chanukah, they'll say a happy Chanukah or joyous Chanukah. And Chag Urim, even though people think that it's a modern manifestation, you know, made by the new culture of Israel, was actually hearkening back to the historians' Chanukah as opposed to the religious leaders' Chanukah. And once again, you don't see in the Talmud any mention of there being assimilationists and that there was a civil war. In fact, where you do see it is this, you know, depending on how you look at it. For a midrash, it's very long. For a history, it's very short. Is Megillat Antiochus, which is also called Megillat Chanukah, the Chanukah scroll, the scroll of Antiochus, where it's basically a long midrash, which gives a detailed understanding of, you know, of the war, you know, the narrative of the war, what was going on, who the players were, how they managed to prevail. You have you know, lots of interesting items in there. So for once, whereas, you know, the Romans decided to attack on Shabbos, and the Jews hid in a cave in order, you know, not to violate the Shabbos, and forgot to, and would not, neglected to, not forgot to, and neglected to fight because they felt like they couldn't be Mechal Shabbos, they couldn't desecrate the Sabbath. And in the Yad Antiochus, we're told that the legions came, they lit a fire at the mouth of the cave where they were all hiding, and there was a great slaughter. And after that, the Maccabees came and fought back and also took many lives. And we're basically told about the military prowess of the Maccabees. Also, one of the more chilling parts of Megillat Antiochus is when Yehuda Maccabee, who was the most valiant of the five brothers. When he was killed in battle, the brothers came back to Matityahu, and Matityahu asked him, "Well, what are you doing here? You know, in other words, why aren't you out in the battle?" And they said, "You know, our brother, who was worth five of us, was killed in battle." And he just looked at them and said, "Yes, your brother was killed, but that doesn't mean you should stop fighting." And then he went and joined them in battle, to where they, you know, ultimately had this great victory. So the Megillat Antiochus, I think, is you know, around the earliest time of the Gaonim. You know, it's like around there, you know, late Talmudic, etc. But what is building are basically the elements of the Chanukah story that Chazal, you know, wants us to know and feels are the most important things to know. And so therefore, omitted from their story is the Civil War, where that would be important to historians. And more importantly in the story was the fact that the few beat the many, etc., etc. So what we're going to do now is look at, before we get to the Chag itself, look at how we're approaching the Chag within, and I think it's important that we do it within the context of what, you know, how other people see the Chag. And that's what we're going to do this, you know, in the time that we have. And so I thought that a PowerPoint would be more important to do it with, primarily because, you know, I'm as much interested in giving a lot of information as I am in the text that we're going to look at, even though we do have texts on the slides, which may not be the best use of a PowerPoint, but, you know, it's what I did. Okay, so, okay. And let's go back on who are the Maccabees and how do we remember them? Let's use all my questions here. So the Maccabees, you know, are mentioned briefly in the Talmud, and we remember them because it was a family that led the rebellion. Whether Matityahu was actually the Kohen Gadol or merely a prominent Kohen is up for some dispute. But he certainly was a valiant warrior, as was Yehuda Maccabee, as we understand. Maccabee comes, you know, literally means, you know, something that perforates and punctures things. You may have heard him called the hammer, you know, but they all were called that. And they founded the Hashmonai kingdom that led, like I said, for a couple hundred years, unfortunately, only to become assimilated with their Greek, you know, their Greek enemies, and so therefore there is this, you know, reservation when it comes to honoring them or talking about them, or, you know, or making a big deal of them. We don't glorify them in any way, at least not in the Talmud, and primarily because I think that they fell into disrepute, that it was a kingdom that was ultimately corrupted, and what should have been a really brilliant, wonderful story turned out to be merely a blip on the screen, and it turned bad. So then the question is, well, why didn't we forget about this place in history altogether? And once again, one can speculate, but we don't really have an answer, except for the fact that just because something doesn't last forever doesn't necessarily take away the power of what it represented at the time. And the question is, what are you celebrating? Are you celebrating the rebirth of a commonwealth, as it were, that the Hashmonean kingdom came back to power, which in the end wasn't for very long, and also got corrupted? Or are you celebrating the fact that the Beit HaMikdash was rededicated at that time, that it was purified, and that the hearts of the nation were once again united and pure, with the assimilationists also losing, and the Jews having a moment of true enlightenment, and the power of the Spirit literally conquering the power and the fury of the military might of the Greeks, the Seleucids. So it's one way or the other. But if we celebrate the rededication of the Beit HaMikdash and also the power to make a mitzvah happen. See, it's also interesting to note that Purim, in the end, emanates from a canonical work. You know, the Megillat Esther is a part of the Tanakh. What's strange about Chanukah is that, you know, we come to know about it through works that have been excluded from the canon, that there isn't even a prohibition about, you know, learning them. And yet, nevertheless, it still became a holiday to celebrate. So in many ways, it demonstrates the power of Torah Shebaal Peh, of an oral tradition, to take something where some of its origins are from the Talmud, but others are dubious, and create, you know, a magnificent holiday that emphasizes the values that we consider eternal and important. So that's like a lot for one slide, 20 minutes on one slide. I think that could be a record for me. So let's go on. So as I mentioned before, you have the Book of Maccabees, you know, a major source for the historians' Chanukah. You have Josephus Flavius, also a major source for the historians' understanding of Chanukah. And, you know, understand that secular Jews often consider those sources to be much more primary than sources we deem sacred. We, on the other hand, that tell us a story, we have this Megillat Antiochus, and also we have, there's a midrashic version of the book of Judith, which is in the Apocrypha, also Sfarim Chitzonim, that we're not supposed to learn. And it's like a Judaized version of Judith that has also come down. So both the apocryphal Judith and the you know, the Jewish book of Judith, I guess we'll say, both of them have a heroine named Judith who successfully assassinates, you know, a governor that is in charge of persecuting the Jews, and gives us a victory, which ultimately ends up, you know, folding into the victory of the Maccabees. You know, that it's the same period, it's the same time, and she's a profound heroine. I bring this up because, you know, it is one of these places where the two versions of what this Chag is all about meet in a very minor way. But I think if they meet at all, it's kind of important to see it. You know what I mean? So let's take a look. So here's what it says. Here's what the book of Judith says. It says, during the siege of the otherwise unknown Jewish city of Bethulia, the beautiful widow Judith is determined to save her people by assassinating the Assyrians' general Holofernes. She acted as if she was forced to flee the city with her maid, reached his camp, and encouraged him to believe that victory would soon be his. Holofernes invited her into his tent for an evening banquet, intending to seduce her. Instead, Judith waited until he fell into a drunken sleep, grabbed his sword, cut off his head, bringing it in a sack to Bethulia. The Hebrew defenders mounted the head on the town's ramparts and soon routed the leaderless Assyrian troops. That's the apocryphal version of Judith. That Judith actually was, like Matahari, sneaking her way into Holofernes's tent and managing to get him unawares, and then drank wine with him. He fell asleep. She chopped off his head, brought it back, and they, put the head on a stake, and then the Jews, the defenders of the Jews, could come out and rout the leaderless Assyrian troops. Okay, that's the version that's in the Apocrypha, which is part of the Catholic Church's Bible, but not part of ours. Now, what happens in the Jewish, and also this is also these are synopses, but they're fairly long midrashim, but very short histories. So in Jewish tradition, the story is different. Tradition teaches that every virgin bride prior to marriage was obliged to sleep with a provincial governor during the period of Assyrian occupation. Judith, the daughter of Yochanan the high priest, right? She gets yichus in this one. Fed the governor cheese, which made him sleepy, right? She seized the opportunity to chop off his head, thus saving the virtue of all future brides from sexual exploitation. In other words, it wasn't about a military victory. It was to stop these averas from proliferating and this abuse of Benot Yisrael and the cessation thereof by killing the governor. This short piece is brought, by the Mishnah Berurah in the Shulchan Aruch, which is where I say the traditions overlap. So this is the version the Mishnah Berurah has. The Mishnah Berurah is a 20th, late 19th, 20th century commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, which is very authoritative, primarily because the Chafetz Chaim, who is the author of the Mishnah Berurah, brought many sources. Basically it works like a Shulchan Aruch. It's only done on Orach Chaim, only done on the holidays and brachot and things of that nature. Not damages or laws pertaining to women or purity, etc. Basically, it only deals with the holidays on the Jewish calendar, brachot, getting up in the morning, what you do, prayers, Birkat HaMazon, for instance, all that kind of stuff is what it deals with, and things that are pertaining to the prayers on the holidays, and also the halachot of Shabbos, Yontif. That's what Orach Chaim is, literally meaning a way of life, right? The way of life, which just basically goes through your Jewish, the calendar and also the habits of day-to-day living. That's what the Mishnah. And so the Mishnah Berurah, when it comes to talking about Hanukkah, mentions the story of Judith, quoting this, kind of latish midrash, and then the reason he brought the story is because the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah, says that it is customary to eat milchiks on Chanukah to remember Judith. And so then the Mishnah Berurah explains who Judith was, in case you didn't know, and what milchiks have to do with her, which is eat cheese till you get sleepy, and hope who's ever close to you doesn't chop off your head. So that's basically the story here. Okay. So that's basically what we have at this stage. So that's the precursors of longer, from a halachic perspective, longish narratives on Hanukkah and what they teach us. So we've kind of dealt with the history. We've dealt with how these historic versions have their Jewish versions and how those versions seep in to the halacha. And let's go on. So there's another Gemara, which, I bring, basically just for fun. And what I mean by just for fun is that it's a Gemara in Avodah Zarah, which of course deals with idolatry and pagan practices and what you're allowed to do with pagans, what you're not allowed to do with pagans, when you do and do not engage in business with pagans, all that kind of stuff. And in the middle of it, they're talking about a particular festival in Avodah Zarah called Saturnalia, I believe it was. And it was a Roman festival that was a winter solstice festival. And from the name, maybe it had something to do with Saturn, I don't know. Anyway, the Gemara says, when Adam noticed the day diminishing, he says, the world becoming darker because of my sins, will it soon return to its unformed state? And so, is this the mortality that the heavens have levied upon me? Right? So Adam's going through the year, and he sees the days are getting shorter. He knows he's going to be punished, or a punishment is coming to him. And that one of the punishments was going to be his mortality. And now that the world is seemingly coming darker and darker, he wondered if that's what's happening. It's going to be one of those types of punishment which is inch by inch going to enshroud you in darkness. So he asked the question. So he worried. So he prayed and he fasted for 8 days. This was during the period of Tevet, the winter solstice. So soon the days became longer. He then realized that this is the way of the world. If I'm going to die, it's not going to be this way. And Adam then chose to feast for 8 days. The following year, both Jews and Gentiles made this into a festival. Adam celebrated for the sake of heaven, and they celebrated it by worshiping idols. So Adam Arishon, right? Adam, the first Adam, decided to create a holiday of Thanksgiving once he realized that there was a cycle to nature, that days were going to get longer, and then, lo and behold, days were going to get shorter. Longer, shorter, longer, shorter. And so he created an 8-day festival. Now, the festival was just a festival, but the festival was celebrating the fact that from the shortest days and the longest nights, light would soon enter the succeeding days, and that light would soon conquer darkness. So in many ways, it was also a festival of light. So one can imagine when someone's recounting what Adam did, that at the very least he's saying that Adam, by his nature, wanted to celebrate a time when the days got longer. So it's like, so why does Chazal bring this at all? So on the one hand, he brings it because there might have been a Jewish attraction during the time of Chazal to participate in these festivities, not necessarily to worship, but the idea that there was a natural tendency to want to do something when the nights were so long. But he doesn't say the Jews did it. He just says, the Chazal just say Adam did it. He celebrated for the sake of heaven, and they celebrated by worshiping idols. In other words, a natural tendency for everybody to want to do something when the nights get shorter and the days get longer. But he was saying some people had the appropriate intention, at least, Adam Arishon did. But the Goyim, when they do it, they've missed the point. They're doing it to celebrate their idols, to worship nature in an inappropriate fashion, and to ignore and not even recognize or realize HaKadosh Baruch Hu's dominion in the world. So therefore, even though natural cycles deserve a certain appreciation, they nevertheless have to be directed toward appreciation toward HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and not toward the so-called gods of nature. So, I mean, I think that's one explanation that they say, like, you may think that we should have a comparable festival. And the truth is, we might have, but Adam did it. But then you see the idolaters did it for exactly the wrong reasons. And we, I think, have to distance ourselves from that behavior. So even though we acknowledge that there could have been a purer tendency here, and had it not been distorted, maybe we would have been having a festival of this kind at this time. Nevertheless, we cannot, because we see that it is easily distorted into the worship of nature. So Yair says, and I like this, he says, it's strange how cheese became mostly a Shavuos food in modern practice. Then the connection to Chanukah is a lot less tenuous. So what do you mean then the connection to Chanukah is a lot less tenuous? What do you mean by that, Yair? Are you still there, Yair? Oh, yeah. There's a period after the then. Oh, okay. Modern practice then. The connection to Chanukah is a lot less tenuous. Oh, so Yair is saying, like, the whole notion of eating milchiks and the land of milk, and we come up with all these midrashic reasons for eating milchiks on Shavuos. But remember, Shavuos doesn't have a mitzvah. So it's like a holiday in search of something tangible to do that's materially distinctive. So the notion of milchiks has to be seen in that light. Whereas Chanukah, has the menorah. We're lighting it every day. It doesn't really even need, the milchiks, so to speak, even though the connection is very, very blatant. It's one of these halachas in the Ramah. That's basically a minhag more than like it says, like he says that it's a good idea to be marbe besuda ktsat. He says it's a good idea to make your meals a little bit fancier, but there's no sudat mitzvah Chanukah. There's no, even though some people read Megillat Antiochus during Chanukah, there's no compelling reason like for Megillat Esther for Purim to read Megillat Antiochus, and by and large most Ashkenazic communities don't read it, even though it's pretty brief. So that's another thing we don't do. We don't eat, in other words, like people have latkes and sour cream, but the oils seem to take over the cheese. But my point is especially when, what's interesting is there are times when the tradition goes out of its way to acknowledge the role of either a heroine or women in general, and that could easily be reflected, and sometimes it's even offered to be reflected in practices. And yet, rather than mind those moments and put them into modern practice, the tendency is to invent things that never were there to try and put them in practice. And that's always more difficult to do because we live in a non-normative age. We live in an age where if you bring in an innovative practice, it is the odds of it being sustained throughout generations for the next several hundred years are very, very small. People don't have a tendency to wonder that, there was a time when nobody made kiddush over a cup of wine. And then there was a decree that wine should, that kiddush should be made al hakos, to make it important, to give it a certain gravitas, right? Just like Havdalah should be said, over a cup of wine, or like benching should be said over a cup of wine, is to give a certain gravitas, chashivut, to the mitzvah. And, we don't know of a community that doesn't make kiddush on a cup of wine, meaning the rabbis could make an edict at one time, and it would be practiced by everyone for literally, thousands of years. And you don't appreciate what a neat trick that is until you try to do something like put an orange on a Seder plate and see that people forgot about it 2 years later, right? I mean, so for instance, and a lot of these things don't even require mitzvot. It requires the reinterpretation of symbols, like charoset. Part of charoset, the reason the apples are there is tachat tapuach orartich, that I have awakened you under the apple tree, which the perush is that while the men were beleaguered from being slaves, it was Benot Yisrael who had the optimism to still keep family life going, having more children, etc., because they believed in the future that the men had given up on. And the Gemara in Sota says, if it wasn't for, Neshei Yisrael, if it wasn't for the women of Israel, we never would have been redeemed. That redemption depended on that. And charoset, when made with apples, is reflecting that understanding. Instead, most people say it's the mortar and they're done. But it's another, it's another way to do it. Okay, I'm glad, Melvin, you have an orange on your Seder plate, right? Then go try and find other oranges. Okay, but what I'm telling you is this, is that it may be that you have one and enjoy your orange. I'm very happy for you. But the truth is that it'll be interesting to see and note whether your custom has legs and will be subsequently followed in generations to come. And my feeling is, not because it's a good idea or a bad idea, it's a fine idea, I guess. People do what they want to do. Just because in this day and age, we do things, they don't have the same staying power, right? We look back, for the things that anchor us. We don't try to create new ones. And part of that has to do, they may do it now, but it doesn't take away from the point whether their children will do it or not, And I don't know. I don't think so. Because I think that when you have an old tradition, recovering traditions is a much simpler thing to do than creating new ones as far as them having staying power, especially when they have an ideological bias. And they're there because the truth is the ideology doesn't always carry through generations. If you want, a minhag or a custom to really remain powerful, it might be best for it to be ideologically neutral. That's what I think, right? But, in other words, could it? Certainly it could. It's just that I think its chances are weaker. And I think, most people would agree with that. Because it's just harder. People don't make new things, In other words, there was a Miriam, cup that was also, on the Seder plate. And I'm sure there are people who will do it. But once again, it's born out of a certain ideology, right? And because it's born out of an ideology, as we know, our kids have a tendency not to believe what we believe, or they do it a little bit differently, and they'll make their own. And since it was an option to do it, they may not do it. It's never going to have the power of matzah. Or even charoset, which everybody says is not a mitzvah, but just something that we do, right? It's kind of become a mitzvah, but it wasn't originally. So Chanukah, which is, a rabbinic invention exclusively, is an important holiday to watch because it does reflect a Jewish activism that became embedded in the calendar. And the question is, if it was somewhat equivocated whether it should be have that prominence or not, because of its non-biblical origins. What were the influences that made it the holiday that we all enjoy? Now, as holidays go, it's a minor holiday, meaning that because of its rabbinic origins, the fact that it's not in the Torah, even if it's alluded to in the Torah, according to the Ramban, from Parshat Bahalotcha et HaNerot, when they put the Nerot on the original menorah of the Beit HaMikdash. He makes a big deal about Aaron not being among the princes or the Nesiim that were in the processional when the Mishkan was dedicated, and Aaron was upset about that, and and he is mollified by the fact that the Midrash says you were excluded here because you're going to be included in another Chanukah, which will be part of the tradition for generations to come, and won't be subject to whether we have a Beit HaMikdash or not. It's going to transcend that. So that's a powerful idea. So is everybody there? I just lost the screen for a second. Okay, just a second. Okay, so that's basically the thing that you have to realize of why Chanukah evokes so much interest, and also has become the powerful holiday that it is. So we're going to, in this class, witness the spiritual significance of Chanukah, and we will also, with the acknowledgement that the fact that Chanukah came around the same time as holidays of other culture has also given it a prominence, a way of acknowledging your distinct identity while still not being denied a celebration when others are having it, and especially where Christianity was large, that also had its impact. So that's what we're going to start with. Next time we're going to do the Gemara, and we're going to go through the Gemara, go through some of the commentaries of the Gemara, point out some of the issues of the Gemara, and from the Gemara there's lots of midrashim to deal with, and then we'll go throughout history and kind of build a conceptual construct of why Chanukah is the meaningful and marvelous Chag it is, not only for the latkes, but for the really emotional, ideological, and spiritual succor that it gives us. So good night, everyone, and God willing, we'll see you next week.